First of all, I think we'll keep going and Ezra will join us eventually. Paul, I want to start with you. And it once again, inspirational to hear you talk and the passion and energy you had about changing the industry. 10 years further on, we also find ourselves potentially in an economic downturn, with government needing to do something and seeing construction as a way forward. We have made big changes, but what are the changes we now need to make to actually get the next tier of success to happen for construction?
I've seen some of the comments, obviously, in the chat line on the right, and the constant call for changes of procurement and so on and so forth. I'm a bit skeptical about that. There's a real issue in the public sector of the fact that good, smart private sector clients use a huge amount of discretion in the procurement process, and they exercise their own prejudices. Mine is, because I'm interested in alignment, I will only work in the projects I'm currently involved with on two-stage design and build or construction management, which is a kind of hard, soft money way of creating alignment. But the public sector's problem is that the immediate neighbour of discretion is corruption. And the extent to which government can free people, especially people who rotate so fast they don't have the skills to make decisions born of discretion, is questionable. So I think the biggest single change is the industry changing the way it sells. I heard over and over again in government, why doesn't government buy whole life? To which my answer was, well, when did you last know how to sell buy whole life? And people would say, I remember somebody on the NHS procurement team saying to me, I'm always told I should standardise doors. Nobody tells me what the gain is. If you came to me and said, this is the gain, and I can guarantee it, by the way, underwrite it. So I think it's a combination of the industry deciding that government has some particular problem to change, I think, rather than waiting. It can't change fundamentally the way it buys.
Yeah, and one of the questions I asked yesterday was around the creation of these very large organizations that can do full integration along the design, construction, and operation phases. And standards are a way of that happening. Phil, you talked about the integrated project delivery, IPD. And in Singapore, they've talked about integrated digital delivery, this idea of bringing it all together. Is this really possible when businesses have different business objectives of their own as well as within the projects?
Well, I think actually, Richard, the problem is, I used to think the problem was technological, and I'm increasingly believing that it's cultural, that you can't align a set of worldviews by having interoperable technologies. In fact, we're going to have to think a little bit more about aligning objectives and using those aligned objectives to align business models and trying to get the cultures aligned. I remember back in my Autodesk days, I remember having sushi lunch in Tokyo with a guy from a major Japanese general contractor. And this was early in the IPD days, and I was observing, gosh, it must be really great to be someplace where the architects and the contractors all work so closely together, and everybody's under one big roof, and everybody has the same name on their shirts. And he looked across the table at me and said, "Oh no, the architects and the builders, we hate each other. We hate each other. We don't get along. We can't align our interests." It was just the same problem under a different brand. And so I'm increasingly convinced that it's not going to be a top-down phenomenon. Some of the research that we've been doing here that I mentioned briefly in my talk is looking at what we're calling episodic integration, which is where the supply chain in small pieces is starting to link together to build a sense of more collaborative and integrative strategies. Because, even at least on this side of the Atlantic, the super integrators are, not doing so well. Katerra's been through some real convulsions. Our friends from WeWork, these are the big examples of lots of money, lots of integrative strategy. It's not going so well. So I think it may end up being more of a bottom-up effort.
Yeah, and I think there's something really interesting there, because these are organizations who claim they could do things differently, the disruptors. And yet there are some disruptors who are doing quite well. So we heard a lot yesterday about modern methods of construction, off-site modular. We've seen Goldman Sachs investing millions of pounds into a top hat modular housing company. Does construction need these disruptors to actually get us to change, or is that inertia too great?
Oh, the disruptor, you absolutely need the disruptors. I agree with Paul that a lot of the desire for disruption has to come top down from the folks that are consuming the work. But, also when a Goldman Sachs gets interested, you have another factor that wasn't present 10 years ago, which is frankly billions of pounds. I mean, I can't keep up with the amount of material that our friends from McKinsey are writing about construction. When we first started this project 20 years ago, McKinsey, they could care less about construction. So there's a lot of energy, and some of that energy is in the form of money, and it takes a lot of money to do the kind of innovation that's going to be necessary to make this happen. And
the numbers that McKinsey were talking about yesterday are enormous. So the doubling of the investment in construction, a recognition that digitization can help, but as you've already said, digitization is not the answer. It's an enabler of things that can change. And Paul, you said you wanted to make this change unstoppable. Is that the case? Because we talked yesterday about clients, and in some ways, having the right clients might be the way to make it unstoppable. And you also mentioned one of the issues with government is that they change roles on a regular basis. So how do we create the perfect client, or how do we create the environment where the client can behave in a better way?
I guess by developing relationships with the private sector. I mean, I entirely agree with Phil that it's not about technology, it's about culture. Culture, of course, culture is about the commercial conditions that we trade in. And in my earliest days in government, I remember a contractor telling me they didn't like partnering. And the reason, because his people were losing the ability to fight and to argue.
Exactly.
And your first thought was, well, that's not a bad thing. But your second thought is actually, if you have to fight to make a living, then you do need to train your people to fight. So you need to find some private sector clients. But above all, you need to start showing them the benefit. The problem at the moment is that too often a more collaborative approach turns out to be somebody just sheltering from the chill wind of competition, and the price drifts up, and the only thing that it improves is the quality of the excuse. So it all comes back to the same thing: making businesses and the patterns of demand. And I think the whole off-site housing thing is a perfect example of that. I remember Mark Prisk, a minister for whom I had a huge amount of time because he really cared about his brief, not just his intro. Saying, would I get involved with an exercise on off-site housing? And I said, you can have a major public house building program. And he said, no, can't do that. I said, well, then no. Because I can't see how you can make progress in my lifetime without consolidation of demand. And while you give the money for housing to 160 housing associations who build 6 each, you're not going to move the market. Now, it may be that Mark and his team have changed the playing around that. But in some places, you need to create demand that wants to buy in a certain way and can buy in a certain way. Because if I was an off-site housing guy, I'm not going to invest 100 million in a plant on the guarantee that government will do something sometime. I want to see a long-term pattern of demand. So again, maybe what's happening there is what happened in BIM. You start something, and the benefits get demonstrated, and then it becomes unstoppable.
So we create a proof of concept, demonstrate it works, and then start linking these things together.
Yes, and so for the next, call it level 3. I don't mind. The loss of level 2 doesn't concern me at all. But what is next? When I look at that huge team sitting in Cambridge, and I wish I'd had half the people 10 years ago. What are they doing? What are they doing, and who's leading them? To show businesses in the middle of the field what they have to do next, what the route map looks like, what Strictly Come Dancing would call the journey. What is the journey?
Yeah, you gave that another great comment there, that companies that make a living in the mud, that murky world, and we all need clarity. We've seen with Grenfell what goes wrong and what can go wrong. It's not just in the UK. This is a global issue. We've seen these tower fires all over the world. One recently in Spain, one recently in South Korea, etc. And also for UK construction, we export our services all over the world. As we move away from our European links, we've got to create a global economy for the UK. Ezra, you were talking about the kind of the global changes due to COVID. Is there a risk that the economic pressures from COVID will create an advantage for the lower cost economies to the detriment of the US or the UK?
I mean, it's going to depend really on sector, but I mean, most folks are arguing the other way, right? Are saying, well, now we're going to need to bring critical services back home, and therefore, we will be able to do more things. The hope is, right, that more things will be brought back on shore. Certainly, services are things that have to be on shore to begin with, right? Not really I mean, maybe consultants are tradable, but not construction services. Right? They're going to have to be on the ground. So I think that I think it's less of a worry about the cost competition in here, more of a focus on market access. I think is probably the way that I would think about it, if that's the question.
Yeah, and one advantage of the standards around building information modeling is that we've created this level playing field for people to operate. But one of the other issues, another question that's come through is the issue of value engineering and this drive for cost, where cost ultimately can end up in an inferior product. An example, working on an airport building and looking for a cheaper product. Is that a good idea, or we focus just on the present and not the lifetime? Paul, once again, is that one of the elements of failure for construction?
Yes. Because 90-something% of the time it's not value engineering, it's just cost cutting. But genuine value engineering, why wouldn't you object to that? And the same people who demand that we buy by value then say there must be no value engineering. And if what that does, without loss of whole life, is uses the skills of the industry to innovate and change, then I think that's a good thing. And it belongs in the pattern. I saw a lot of comments yesterday about Grenfell saying if only the architect specifications survive through to the end of the job, everything will be fine. Go and listen to the evidence of the architect on Grenfell before you decide that. Hear what they're saying. It's simply not the answer. And you talking about all similar and approved and so on. Well, the clue is in the word approved. People with the skills to know what you should and shouldn't approve are necessary. So there needs to be a bit more strength. But actually, the process of value engineering, which tests an idea, is an entirely proper one. And some of the decisions that clients make, they're allowed to make. I just quoted the Taj Mahal, the example of a high-value building. It was worth it to Shah Jahan. So I've often said to a client, is this worth another £1 million of your money? Because if it is, that's fine.
Phil, go on.
Yeah, I mean, but I agree. I completely agree with Paul. With this goes back to the earlier comments about culture. Because we have these kinds of misaligned sets of expectations in the supply chain, the lowest common denominator is lowest cost. I mean, when I was an architect working on an airport and my client decided to do value engineering, and I suggested that value engineering was just the systematic cheapening of the building, my client, they got angry because they were that process was so kind of instantiated into their psyche about how they went about doing projects. But the problem is we don't talk about outcomes. We don't talk about things that we're trying to make happen, whether they're whole life costs or other things. Teams are only aligned around their sort of sub-optimized objectives. And the one sub-optimized objective that everybody across the supply chain shares is lowest cost. So you've got to reorient that conversation to what are we trying to make happen here and how can we make that thing happen? And that'll get us out of, then low cost becomes just another parameter. It does not become the thing that we're trying to accomplish in the absence of any other objective. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. But surely lowest cost has to be balanced against the quality requirement and the performance requirement. So I think in the future, there's three areas that we will select products through: cost, carbon, and compliance. So cost is no longer a function if the product doesn't comply with the requirement, because it's no longer achieving that objective either short or long term. So right. Within there somewhere, the specification of the product still has to, and the selection of an alternative still has to meet an objective. And I think the concern that was raised here was that this was an inferior product that might be put forward. So how do we stop that from happening, where somebody still has to ensure that performance is key?
So can I add just one general point, Richard? I mean, if we look across multiple industries, the evidence is essentially incontrovertible that the cost lever alone is not going to let you outperform coming out of this current recession. It's just not sufficient. If you look at what happened back in 2008, 2009, around optionality, around people actually going on offense, about increasing product, all of the folks who actually ended up in the top quartile of performance did not just focus on costs, because it's only one lever. So we can have a theoretical argument about it, but we could also just say, look at who actually outperformed and gave returns to their shareholders, and those are the ones that take more political that Phil and Paul are articulating in this case. The evidence is incontrovertible.
Richard, with of course the nature of our clients, especially big clients and especially public sector clients, which is they won't be there for very long, and so lowest cost is a very easily recognised thing, and of course they don't really mind how much it costs as long as it's less than the budget. Tick, no embarrassment. But embarrassment's a huge factor inside government law, a massive factor. Just avoid embarrassment. So if you can tick it within budget, you'll be gone. And the problem of a rapidly rotating civil service is just that. Nobody's ever been asked a question before. Everything gets approached as if it's ever happened again. So, we've got the civil service we demanded, a smaller one. But where are the skills gone? Where's the corporate going? Nobody. Within 5 years of me leaving government, nobody I worked with was still working in construction inside the civil service. Nobody.
It's a proxy for the building supply chain, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's the same thing as ephemeral supply chains in the building industry.
Yes.
And so I completely agree with Paul. Some of the research that we've been doing here on the forced labor question is what drives a disaggregated supply chain to improve itself. And one of the consensus theories is shame, right? You have to shame people into doing the right thing.
Yeah.
That's a really scary point to end on. I was hoping we'd get into data and talking about data and data being at the heart of these next stages, which are talking about generative design and machine learning. None of that works without data. And Ezra, we could look at other sectors and see that data is a way that these sectors have transformed. I think we will probably need to come back to this whole subject, maybe as another mini conference, and talk a little bit more about that. But for the moment, I'm afraid it's time for us to start to wind this session down. We do have approximately 15 minutes for all of you to go and make yourself a cup of coffee. Do use the networking. Personally, I found the networking absolutely fantastic. It's speed dating for construction. In the next sessions, you're going to split into two groups. So for designers and contractors, there are things for you. And for the manufacturers, there's another stream for you as well. You'll get some instructions coming up on the screen to explain how to enter those different sessions. So thank you to Paul, Phil, and Ezra for the comments and the presentations they've made. And I'll look forward to seeing you at the end of the next sessions, where I'll do some summing up. So back with us in just under 15 minutes. Talk to you soon.